Hey guys, welcome back, I'm Jay. In this episode, we're going to look at EC2 placement groups. When you launch a new instance, EC2 attempts to place the instance so that all of your instances are spread out across the underlying hardware in order to minimize correlated failures. Here is an example of a normal EC2 placement. Suppose you have an instance running in one availability zone. When you launch new instances, EC2 will try to place them in different availability zones, or on a different racks of physical servers, so that all of your instances are spread across different hardware. In the event of any hardware failure, interruption on one physical server only affects the local instances, and doesn't impact instances on other servers. Spreading instances placement can minimize the impact caused by correlated hardware failures. EC2 provides placement groups that you can use to influence the placement of a group of instances to meet the needs of your workload. There is no additional cost for creating a placement group. You only pay for the instances launched in the placement group. Depending on the type of workload, you can create a placement group using one of three placement strategies. They're cluster placement groups, partition placement groups, and spread placement groups. A cluster placement group packs instances close together inside an availability zone. This strategy enables workloads to achieve the low latency network necessary for tightly coupled communication, typically for HPC applications. A partition placement group spreads your instances across logical partitions, so that groups of instances in one partition do not share the underlying hardware with groups of instances in different partitions. It's typically used by large distributed workloads, such as Hadoop cluster, Cassandra, and Kafka. A spread placement group strictly spreads your instances across different hardware to reduce correlated failures. A cluster placement group is a logical grouping of instances within a single availability zone, which helps achieve low latency network between instances. A cluster placement group can span peered VPCs in the same region. When you have VPC peering, instances in peered VPCs can be placed in the same placement group. However, a cluster placement group cannot span multiple availability zones. Instances in a cluster placement group must be launched in the same availability zone. Cluster placement groups are recommended for applications that benefit from low latency and high throughput network between EC2 instances. They are also recommended when the majority of network traffic is between the instances. To provide the lowest latency and highest packet per second network performance for your placement group, you should choose an instance type that supports enhanced networking. Enhanced networking uses single root I/O virtualization to provide high-performance networking capabilities. For the best performance, it's recommended that you should use the same instance type for all instances in the placement group. You should use a single launch request to launch the number of instances you need in the placement group. If you try to add more instances to the placement group later, or launch more than one instance type in the placement group, you increase the chances of getting an insufficient capacity error. If you stop an instance in a placement group and then start it again, it still runs in the placement group. However, the start might fail if there isn't enough capacity for the instance. If you launch an instance in a placement group with running instances, and receive the capacity error, you can stop and start all of the instances in the placement group. Starting the instances may migrate them to new hardware that has capacity for all requested instances. A partition placement group has a few logical segments called partitions. A partition is like a subgroup within a placement group. Each partition can have multiple instances. Each partition within a placement group has its own set of racks. Each rack has its own network and power source. No two partitions within a placement group can share the same set of racks. Instances in one partition don't share the same rack with instances in other partitions. This allows you to isolate the impact of a single hardware failure. By default, when you launch instances into a partition placement group, EC2 tries to evenly distribute the instances across all partitions. However, it doesn't guarantee an even distribution. You can also launch instances into a specific partition to have more control over the instance placement. Partition placement groups can be used to deploy large distributed and replicated workloads, such as Hadoop, Cassandra, and Kafka. A partition placement group can span multiple availability zones in the same region, with a maximum of 7 partitions per availability zone. The number of instances that can be placed into a partition placement group is limited only by your account limits. In addition, partition placement groups offer visibility into the partitions, so that you can see which instances are in which partitions. You can share this information with topology-aware applications, such as HDFS, HBase, and Cassandra. These applications use the placement information to make intelligent data replication decisions. When you launch an instance in a partition placement group, if there is insufficient unique hardware to fulfill the request will fail. You can make the request again at a later stage, as EC2 will make new hardware available over time. A spread placement group is a group of instances where each instance is placed on a distinct rack, and each rack having its own network and power source. Spread placement groups are recommended for applications with a small number of critical instances that need to be running on separate hardware. Launching instances in a spread placement group reduces the risk of simultaneous failures. Spread placement groups are suited if you want to launch a mix of instance types, or add new instances in the placement group over time. A spread placement group can span multiple availability zones in the same region. You can have a maximum of 7 running instances per availability zone per group. When you launch an instance in a spread placement group, if there is insufficient unique hardware to fulfill the request will fail. You can make the request again at a later stage, as EC2 will make new hardware available over time. In this episode, we've learned EC2 placement groups. You can use placement groups to influence the placement of instances to meet the needs of your workload. A cluster placement group packs instances close together in a single availability zone. This strategy enables workloads to achieve the low latency network necessary for tightly coupled communication, typically for HPC applications. A cluster placement group cannot span multiple availability zones. A partition placement group spreads your instances across logical partitions, so that groups of instances in one partition do not share the underlying hardware with groups of instances in different partitions. It's typically used by large distributed workloads, such as Hadoop, Cassandra, and Kafka. A partition placement group can have partitions in multiple availability zones in the same region. A spread placement group strictly spreads your instances across different hardware to reduce correlated failures. A spread placement group can span multiple availability zones in the same region. There is no additional cost to use placement groups. You only pay for the instances launched in the placement group. Okay, that's all for EC2 placement groups. Thanks for watching and see you in the next episode.
Hope you've enjoyed watching this episode. If you liked the video, please help us and hit the like button. If you want to watch more tutorials, please subscribe to the Cloudemy TV channel. Make sure to turn on the notification and stay tuned. At Cloudemy, we're passionate about cloud and AI technology. Please share your feedback and thoughts in the comments below. Feel free to let us know what topics you'd like to watch. Happy watching and happy learning.